Think forward. Think Research Channel.
In the late 1960s and in the early 1970s, Harold Scheub walked thousands of miles along the southeastern coastal areas of Africa. With limited supplies, he set out on his journey, collecting and documenting the stories, songs, and poems of the Xhosa, Swati, and Ndebele and Zulu peoples. He collected thousands of stories.
I've always been interested in stories. I'm convinced that stories are the way we make sense of the world that we live in. And I don't think human beings can do without stories of some kind, whether it's sitting around the hearth fire, or whether it's sitting in front of the television set, or the computer. Stories are absolutely essential to human existence. They tell us who we are, where we come from, and they really make it possible for us to understand that there's a resonance in our lives that stretches to earlier times in human existence. What we do, what storytellers do when they put stories together, is they have two basic repertories of imagery. They take images from the past. These are often called motifs, and these are often fantasy or mythic motifs. And they bring these together with contemporary images. That's why human beings do not memorize stories. Every time we tell the story, it's a new story. So that the storyteller is always taking our contemporary lives and coupling our contemporary lives to the ideals of the past. So that the past is regularly influencing the way we look at the present, and the present is always influencing the way we look at the past. So history is always revisionist history. It's a floating flotsam and jetsam of human experiences. I had no idea what to expect when I went to South Africa. Again, apartheid was in control. The government was not anxious to have me have face-to-face relationships with African people. They wanted me to do work in the archives or in the libraries, and I insisted that I be allowed to work in the rural countryside among storytellers, and in the end they allowed me to do this. So what I did during 4 year-long periods at various times, not all together, I walked up and down the southeastern coast of the continent, 1,500 miles during each of those wonderful years, working with storytellers in various oral traditions. The Xhosa, further north among the Zulu, in Swaziland among the Swati people, and in the southern part of Zimbabwe among the Ndebele people. And what I did, I never used a car. I simply set out. I had a tape recorder that I had picked up in Germany on my way to South Africa. It was one of these reel-to-reel tape recorders, heavy. Took 5 size D flashlight batteries. And I remember that my knapsack was just loaded down with batteries because if I had a good storytelling day, I would go through 1 set of batteries in a day, and batteries was the bane of my existence. I was always having people send batteries to little villages along the way so that I could pick them up along the way. And I had everything that I had was in my knapsack. I had my tape recorder, and then I had a small camera that I carried with me. I had a pup tent that I would sleep in at night, and I had a couple of cans of beans. Had no idea what to expect. And I worked in the most remote areas of southern Africa that I was able to find, which was along the southeastern corridor, along the Indian Ocean. We are now about 10 miles from the Indian Ocean among the Xhosa people. The Xhosa do not organize their homes into villages. The 6 houses that you see in the foreground here are of a single family. The husband and wife might live in one house. The children might live in a couple of the houses. There might be a house for visitors, a kitchen house, a storage house. And in the foreground, you see the cattle kraal. That's where they would keep the cattle at night. And what I would do is I would go into these areas and just start walking and try to get myself invited to storytelling sessions. I didn't really want to set up artificial storytelling sessions. I wanted to be invited to actual ongoing storytelling activities. And you can see here that the people's homes are on the lips of these ridges, and then they would farm down in the valleys. And I would simply go from home to home, attempting to get myself, as I said, invited to storytelling sessions. I start out early in the morning. Here you see the fog early in the morning. Here you see down in the valley is where the people would farm, their houses on the lips of the ridges. Just to set up the context for the storytelling sessions, everybody. Here are homes, Xhosa homes, other Xhosa homes as we're moving down closer to the sea. This is in the winter month now. You can see that the grasses are pretty brown. In the southern part of Zimbabwe, the architecture becomes a little bit different. You can still see the rondavel-style homes, but there are also rectangular houses and there are square houses. And on the left, you can see these little containers. This is where, during the winter months, the grain would be stored. We're in the southern part of Africa. It's a Mediterranean climate, so that it can get pretty cold in the wintertime. In fact, in Lesotho, which you see here, the homes are built more substantially because it snows up in the mountains. This is a Xhosa woman. She is wearing the traditional Xhosa garb. Her cape is dyed with a red ochre. And you can see that she is also wearing a red ochre cosmetic. A boy going off to the market. A girl babysitting her baby sister. A mother and her child. By the time a boy is 12 years old, he will already be taking on the responsibilities of adulthood. Here you see a boy herding the livestock of his home. He may be away from home for as long as 2 weeks, looking for grazing land, looking for water for the family's livestock. A Xhosa girl. A boy and his sister. These are 4 married men. They're going off to a convention. And here you can see the traditional beadwork of the Xhosa people. Women going to the market. Xhosa women. These are some Xhosa girls. They're going to a party. And they're going to meet these guys. And here's the band. Before a boy goes through his puberty rite of passage, stick fighting is a very, very important sport. It's like medieval jousting. Typically, a girlfriend will bead the costumes that the boys wear. In the background, you can see the boy beating the drum. It's a beautiful thing to watch. It's like a combination of dance and athletic prowess. These are traditional doctors. They are wearing the white bead that is emblematic of the doctor's profession in this part of Africa. I want to emphasize that these are not witch doctors. There are no more witch doctors in Africa than there are in America. These are proper doctors practicing traditional medicine. The people in this area, these pictures are taken at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. So in South Africa, apartheid was still very, very much in control of the country. And in fact, at that time, it really was beyond comprehension that freedom would come to South Africa in the 1990s. So the people, the African people, were very, very poor. Here you see a woman, her child on her back, plowing the land. Corn, staple food. Cattle, very important. Here you see boys who are plowing the fields, and you see that they are boys. In some parts of Africa, some parts of the areas where I worked, there were no able-bodied men at all. They had all been taken to work in the gold mines, in the sugar plantations, in the diamond fields. So that in order to force the African men to leave their homes, the government imposed fines on everything. There were house taxes, there were taxes on dogs. The people had no cash crops, so in order to pay their taxes, the men were forced to go to the mines in Johannesburg, in Kimberley, in Natal province, and so the children and the women had to do the work. And here you see the children with the oxen plowing the fields. As I said, cattle, very, very important, not only a part of the symbol system, of the economic system, also a part of the symbol system of the people, cattle. And the government, in order to keep the cattle from overgrazing the land, forced the people to have their cattle counted twice a year. And here you see the cattle in the process of being counted, so they wouldn't have too many head of cattle. If you're lucky, you had horses to get around on. Traditionally, when grain had to be ground, people used the mortar and pestle, but in more contemporary times, the women, as you see here, would take their grain to the market, and it would be ground at the market. Xhosa children, teenagers. So, another area where the able-bodied men are absent, so the women are going to build a house. And so here you see the women getting water, and then they mold the bricks out of a combination of earth and clay, as you see here, and then the bricks are allowed to dry in the sun. And then the women take the bricks and they make the walls of the house. The walls made, they gather the thatch, which has been very carefully dried over a period of time. The thatch now prepared, and the house, the roof of the house will be put on, and a roof like this may last anywhere from 15 to 20 years. So this is the scene. It's evening, storytelling time. People arriving for storytelling. And here you see a Xhosa grandmother who is performing for her grandchildren and some of their friends. Now, I had a particular problem when I really did want to document storytelling. I taped the stories, and over the years I've taped some 10,000 stories and histories and biographies and myths. Storytelling typically took place in the evenings, around the hearth fire, in the home. When storytelling did take place under those circumstances, I taped the stories, but I did not want to take pictures because I feared that the flashbulbs would interfere with the storytelling session. So the only time I took photographs or slides would be in the evening, as you see here, when it was possible for me to take pictures outside. I want to emphasize that I never interfered with the storytelling session. If the storytelling was taking place outside and it was convenient and it was acceptable to the performer and her audience, then I took pictures. And I also learned immediately how important the human body is when a story is being told, and learned that probably, conservatively, 50% of the meaning of the story is nonverbal, in the tone of the storyteller's voice, in the use that the storyteller made of her body, and the way the verbal elements of the story were integrated with the movement of the body and with the tone of the story. And what would happen is the storyteller would be in a squatting position, and in the upper part of her thighs and in the upper part of her shoulders, she would create a kind of a metronomic beat to the story. And it could be very subtle, and also could be very dramatic. And then with her forearms, with her face, she would mime what's happening in the stories. So there's a very attractive aesthetic distance between the regular dance-like movement of the story and then the very particular use that the storyteller makes of her body as she describes what is happening in the story. So this combination is the way the storyteller unites the various parts of the story and creates metaphor, metaphor being the very essence of the story. So whether a storyteller uses her body in a dramatic way or in a subtle way, use her body she will. And this was driven home to me again and again and again as I watched these stories and saw how the audiences responded to this wonderful, rhythmical, hypnotic kind of spell that the storyteller was creating. I remember once hearing a story among the Zulu, and there were songs in the story, and the songs got so dramatic that when the storyteller came to the point where the story sort of evolved into song, everybody was up dancing. A very dangerous thing for a storyteller, because she had to bring them back into the story again. So it took a storyteller who was very certain of herself to be able to do this. I've also seen stories in which the song would evolve into the audience dancing, and if the audience was not very impressed with the storyteller, they would just continue dancing, a rather not so subtle way of telling the storyteller that the story is over. It's sort of like the cane in vaudeville when they pull you off the stage. So audiences were very demanding. And when a great storyteller came along, and there are wonderful Homeric storytellers in southern Africa, the audience loved that and relished it and kept that story and the storyteller going for a long period of time. If a storyteller was in tune with her audience, then the story could go on for at great length. If the storyteller wasn't doing very well, then what the storyteller would do is end the story pretty quickly. It would be a full story, but it would be over very, very quickly. So here's the grandmother performing for her grandchildren. And here you see her miming a grandmother who is caressing her grandchild or holding her grandchild. This is a Zulu performer. Audience out where we are. Another Zulu performer. You can see the shadows of her audience. There they are. This is an Ndebele mother performing for her twin daughters. Now, storytelling in southern Africa typically is in the province of women. Women are the storytellers, men are traditionally the historians and the poets. But there's not a strict gender division here. Storytelling really does cross gender lines. But by and large, the women are the storytellers. They are therefore the carriers of the culture. But again, I want to emphasize that men also tell stories. Here you see a 16-year-old boy telling stories, and he will tell stories up to the time he goes through the puberty rite of passage, and then typically he would not tell stories again until he tells stories for his own children. A Xhosa storyteller. An Ndebele father performing for his family. A Xhosa storyteller during a contemplative moment in the story. Now, just take a look at the way storytellers use their bodies. There is no strict kind of a way to use the body. Every storyteller will use her body in her own way. So I've just selected a couple of slides here to show you how various storytellers communicate essentially the same moment in a story. The victim is up in a tree, the villain down below, the victim very frightened, the storyteller trying to deal with the menace of the villain, the plight of the victim, and trying to keep the story going ahead at the same time. So here's the way one storyteller would do it. Another. Another. And another. So that storytellers will use their bodies, but they will use their bodies in their own particular way. And sometimes storytellers will use their body in a very dramatic way, and others will be much more subtle. But always they will use their bodies. The body, nonverbal aspects of storytelling are as much a part of the story as the verbal parts are. In fact, this particular woman, who was a very popular storyteller, often her stories, when you transcribe from the tape her stories, they don't make a whole lot of sense because so much of the story was communicated in a nonverbal way by her body. A beautiful thing to watch. So always there is that combination of speech and dance in these stories, and music, the music of the word. The storytellers will take the music of these oral languages and they will exploit that music in a poetic kind of a way to communicate emotions, because emotions are right at the heart of storytelling. Here you see a Xhosa storyteller. Another Xhosa storyteller. This is a Swati storyteller in Swaziland, audience out to our right. Here is a Xhosa storyteller who is miming a woman using a mortar and pestle, grinding her grain. To show you that the storytelling tradition remains intact and very much alive, this picture is taken in the southern part of Zimbabwe. These are Ndebele girls, schoolgirls, who are telling stories during a break at school. So the storytelling tradition will alter, it'll change, it'll involve contemporary events and so forth, but the storytelling tradition remains very much alive. And storytelling begins at a very young age. A Zulu girl, 6 years old, performing. Typically, her audiences will not consist of adults, but other children. And the reason is that this child is learning the essence of storytelling. And so what happens is she often gets caught up in the pattern of the story, the pattern which tells so much about the meaning of the story, and won't let that pattern go and keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. And it may drive an adult audience crazy. But what's happening is this child is learning the essence of how to tell good stories, patterning at the heart of stories. A Zulu storyteller performing for her children out where we are. She's moving up to the point where the villain moves in. And here you can see that the face is also a very important part of storytelling. Women telling stories. Now, I have a couple of sequences of storytellers just to show you how the storyteller deals with the most active part of a story. In both of these cases, these are both Zulu storytellers that you're going to see. It's during the chase, C-H-A-S-E, the chase sequence in the story, when the villain is giving chase to the victim. And so the storyteller, with her voice and with her body, is trying to suggest all of these activities simultaneously. And here you see this particular Zulu storyteller doing that. So again, you see the body. And the question is, how do you capture this in print? And here's a second Zulu storyteller, again, during the chase sequence of the story. And again, you can see the vital role that the body plays. This interested me a lot. This is among the Xhosa. There's a huge audience for this out where we are. The woman in the foreground is telling the story, the older woman. The woman in the background is miming what the woman in the foreground is doing, is saying. So the woman in the foreground is telling the story. The woman in the background knows her well, knows her repertory of stories well. And so the woman in the background, in a dance-like way, is miming everything that the woman in the foreground is doing, and in the process, again, in a nonverbal way, is commenting upon what the story that the woman in the foreground is telling. It's a beautiful kind of a relationship that exists. Again, dance-like, and the audiences just loved it. This is a bard for a king, creating a heroic poem for the king. And now, for the rest of this discussion, I want you to meet this woman. Her name was Nongenile Masitatu Zenani, a Xhosa woman, the greatest storyteller I ever met, and one of the best friends I have ever had. All of these pictures now are going to be of this magnificent storyteller. I met her the first time I went to Southern Africa to do research, which was in the late 1960s. And then, and I collected a repertory of stories from her, and she was quite splendid. And the second time I went back, which was in the early 1970s, I was going to work further north among the Zulu. She was a Xhosa. Her husband had died of tuberculosis since the last time I was there, so I went to stay with her during the last weeks of her mourning period as an act of friendship. And when her mourning period was over, she, canny woman that she was, knew that she was going to destroy my Zulu research project. She invited us all to come back the following day. She was going to tell a story that I had never heard before, and she wanted me there to tape it for posterity. She explained to the audience that she had heard the story when she was a teenager from her great-aunt, had heard it in bits and pieces, told it in bits and pieces since then, but never in its entirety, and pointing out that her grandchildren were going to Western-style schools with Dickens and Emma stuck in their pockets, no longer interested in the oral tradition, she wanted me there to tape it for posterity. We were to begin, the story was to begin, at 10 o'clock in the morning the following day. I had never heard a story begun at 10 o'clock in the morning before. The Xhosa have a tradition that if you tell stories in the daytime, you're going to grow horns. And the reason, of course, is to keep the kids from bugging the parents to tell them stories when the kids should be doing their chores. But storytelling, as I found out, for adults takes place at all times of day or night. She was then around 65 years old. In her audience were 7 women and 2 men of her age, and then the audience waxed and waned as time went on. As I said, she explained to everybody that she had heard this story when she was a teenager, and she wanted to tell it once more, and she wanted me there to tape it. And she explained that men were by and large the oral historians and the oral poets of Xhosa society, so the origins of Xhosa society were always given a kind of a male spin. And what she was going to do in this ancient Xhosa story was to tell the origins of Xhosa society in epic form from a woman's point of view. So her heroes were women. Here you see, during the story is very long, so during contemplative moments of the story, even though her body may not be actively engaged, her hands would always be busily sculpting the story. Always her body was involved in the creation of the story. So she began telling the story at 10 o'clock in the morning. It went on for 4 hours. We took a break, came back in the afternoon. It went on for 3 more hours, 7 hours. The first time I ever heard a story continued into the next day. The next day it went on for 4 hours. The next day for 5 hours. And on she went. For 21 days, this woman performed one story. Now, she was a doctor, so she had to be away seeing to her patients for 4 of those days. So actually 17 of the days were performance days. When it was over, it was 150 hours long. To give you a sense of the staggering length of that story, when I translated and transcribed the story, each of the 17 days averages out to around 400 pages. If Homer would have created the Odyssey at a single sitting, it may have taken him 35 hours. It was magnificent. But that was only part of the story. That was in July. She invited us all to come back the following October for part 2 of what she considered a 3-part Xhosa epic. My Zulu research project went up in flames. There was no way I would miss this. The following October, part 2, 150 hours, and then the following January, part 3, so that the 3-part epic amounted to something like 500 hours. Absolutely glorious. And so here she is. What I tried to do, I taped the entire story, of course, and what I tried to do was to document the way Mazitatu Zenani used her body in telling her story. So these are a few of those slides of a person who is undeniably one of Africa's great storytellers.
Ndoda umfazi wazala umfazi wazala inkwenkwe akaze aphinda amithe lo mfazi wahlala ke ngoku engamithi tu uhleli wahlala lo mfazi engamithi inhliziyo yakhe yabhlungu lento ngamithi kuba ngonje yakhula kanamntana wafuna umuntu okwazi ukunyanga umuntu amithe konke wathi abefikile kulo muntu wathi umuntu lo uzolithatha iyeza ke andikalikhinguku uthe kwafika ixesha wathuma inkwenkwe leyo bamayolithatha iyezelo iyile ke inkwenkwe yayolithatha iyeza likanina eliyeza ke kwedini unyoko azalifake eziko athi alufake eziko ke alibasele athi alibasela ke alihlafuni aliginye ungakulinga ulityeke wena eliyeza hayi andutyayeza mna yahamba inkwenkwe ufika ekhaya yathi ke yawufika ekhaya ke ayamnika unini iyeza yafika engekho yathi awufika engekho yathi awujonge eliyeza lihleli lifanele uba mandi yalifaka eziko lavutha iyeza yalitya yahlala inkwenkwe konje ke wafika unina amnika ke unina wamnika ke elibelishiyekile kutheni lento alenze ngaka eliyeza libe lincinci kangaka hayi ndazi ke mina undinike elo uthe zendilithini uthi zilifaka eziko ulitye walifaka ke unina wenkwenkwe eziko naye walitya ngoku ke inkwenkwe ihambe yahamba yazibona iphuma amabele yabona iphuma amabele inkwenkwe yamani wacofa amabele tyhini ndiphuma amabele yathi ke yaba iphuma lamabele isisu sasikhulu senkwenkwe tyhini lenkwenkwe imithi ngoku yahlala apha lenkwenkwe imithi njalo yasoloko yayoyika lento yathi ngonje kwambatha oku yayiqhobosha ingubo yoyika lento yalamabele kwakunye nesi sisu sikhulayo yahlala zahamba inyanga lenkwenkwe ikhulelwa apha esisisu ihlala yodwa ingavumani namanye amakhwenkwe ngonje amabele ayakhula yasoloko inkwenkwe emana ukuhambela bucala kwamanye yahlala lenkwenkwe zahamba zona inyanga awu konje lenkwenkwe ikhulelwe ngoku yaba ikhulelwe inkwenkwe yeva ilunywa yalunywa apha lenkwenkwe isezimpahleni salusa yathi he aziba into nalento nayo iyakuvaka ukushukuma komntana apha esiswini into ekho lento ayithethi iyayifihla ebantwini iyeva uba kushukuma into apha esiswini yahlala yathi aboma awuyalunywa impela yemba phansi yemba yenza indlu kakuhle ikrolonqa lento yemba esidulwini yalunywa inkwenkwe yathi aqonda uba hayibo ndilunywa kakhulu ngoku yangena apha yazala intombi inkwenkwe yathi yawuzala lo mntana yamvalela apha yafuna into zokuvala namatya amakhulu yavala hamba kwalusa inkomo yazigudusa inkomo iyasenga ke kowayo ke amaselwa wakudala yayisisikhumba senkomo kusukwe isikhumba senkomo sithungwe senze umlomo yayingamasi kamasa galelwa kulonto yahlala kapha lento yahlala ngolhlobo yathi ke ngoku lenkwenkwe xa isengayo yamana uba nobisela ubayo iligalele eseleni yolifihla ingayinalo endlini ihambe ke ibheke endlini ifike ithe ubisolo ihlale ikihlahla lithi nya nangorhatya imke ngokusezivalo linkomo uyephi nalomntana angene ubuyephi hayi bendibheke ethafeni amana uzimela ke yakutyisa lo mntana akhe.
The greatest storyteller I ever met, Ndebele Masitatu Zenani, a Xhosa storyteller, who created 3 segments of an epic over a year period, each one about 150 hours long. And she was probably my greatest teacher as far as the oral traditions were concerned. We would sit around, talk about the stories, and she would interpret the stories, and her audience also interpreted the stories. And it wasn't as if everybody always agreed on the meaning of the stories, because after all, these are works of art. But one thing that was very clear, and that was that these stories put the lie to the idea that stories are simple little Aesop's fable type stories with sort of morals attached to the end. It doesn't work that way. I remember once I was working among the Zulu, And I was feeling pretty full of myself as far as the Zulu language was concerned, I remember. And the storyteller created a story. And when it was over, people were talking about the story. And I, feeling very full of myself, as I said, began to wax heroic about the meaning of the story. And midway in my peroration, she stopped me and said, wait a minute, she said. If I'm to explain to you what my story means, I must tell you my story again. For her, it was not possible to come to the end of the story and Aesop's fable-like give a kind of a homiletic kind of a preachment. That's not what stories are. For her, and I learned, this is very, very important, the meaning of story is in the totality of the story. Not simply in the way the story ends, but in everything that the storyteller is doing in the story. And I can still remember the first time I ever told Jack and the Beanstalk in Xhosa, and it was a total disaster. And I remember people laughed at me as I was telling it, and afterwards they all gathered around, and they taught me what I had done wrong, what was necessary. It was the best thing that could ever have happened to me. Because it was not one of these things, you know, where the grad student sort of sits in the back taking notes and so forth. They would not allow this. I had to be a part of it. And it was just wonderful. First of all, it helped me to develop my expertness in the language, but most of all, it took me under the skin of these stories and understanding how storytellers put the stories together. So this was enormously important to me. And as I was doing this, the storytellers really impressed upon me how integral and important these stories are to these oral traditions. An oral tradition, O-R-A-L. An oral tradition is a tradition in which ideals and values are communicated from one generation to the next, primarily by means of the spoken word. Everything that is important to the community is lodged in the imagination and in the memory of the storyteller. And the storyteller puts down a conduit to the past and remembers the past, and as I said earlier, brings it into conjunction with the present. Another thing I learned about storytelling, I remember the first time I ever heard a story, it was among the Mponda Mise people of the Xhosa. And it was around a hearth fire in the evening, and the story started, and I thought that I had learned the wrong language. It just washed over me like a flood. And what I had done is I had learned a kind of a literary form of the language. This was an oral form, and I learned very quickly that the oral form and literary form can be very different. So I had to make a decision. It would have been very easy for me to have worked with interpreters and translators. But I made a firm decision that that was not what I was going to do. I was going to come to terms with this language, and people didn't speak English. It was sink or swim. I really had to master the language. It was the best thing I could have done. It took around 6 months before I really began to flow with the language. And then after that, after I had convinced myself that you don't have to be 6 years old to learn a language, then that gave me a lot of faith in myself, and so from then on, what I would do is I would internalize a grammar and a vocabulary, and then move into the area, and it was sink or swim. I had to come to terms with it, and so over a period, what I did was, in the late 1960s, and then twice in the early 70s, I did this 1,500-mile walk, and I collected something like 9,000 stories, somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 stories, epics, histories, poetry, on tape and on film. And the fourth time I went back, I didn't collect anything. I went over the same route, but this time I carried with me some of the stories I had collected and wanted to talk to the storytellers and make sure that I was understanding what was going on in the stories and that my interpretation of the stories was what it should be. When I first went to South Africa, the stories that I learned later on, were truncated. My presence at the storytelling session did have a stultifying effect on the story. And so it's very important that I went back again and again, because as I came back, and as I was, the second time I went back, I was in the folklore myself, and so it was no difficulty whatsoever being invited to storytelling sessions then, and my presence then was no longer a problem, and I simply blended in with the audience, So I do think that over the years, the collection that I made in Southern Africa is an accurate and adequate collection of this oral tradition as it existed at that particular point in South African history. And the oral tradition is changing, as it does everywhere in the world, so that those same stories that they were being told today would not be told as they were in the 70s and in the 60s. Just as in the 70s and 60s, those versions would be different from those at the turn of the century. Apartheid South Africa. I remember once I had been working in the rural countryside of South Africa, and I went to Johannesburg and went to Soweto, the African township 15 miles outside Johannesburg. And I got to know pretty well a number of young revolutionaries who were involved in the struggle against apartheid. And they were interested in what I was doing. And they wanted to hear some of the stories that I had been collecting. And when I played the stories to them, they were not impressed. Where, they said, where in these stories are the anti-apartheid themes? These stories deal with general kinds of things. They don't have anything to do with the specifics of what life is like living under this racist system of apartheid. And I was stung by their comments. And when I went back to the countryside, I told the storytellers what they had said. And to a person, they said something like this: how do you think we have survived 350 years of apartheid? It is the truths, they said, that are embodied in these stories that have helped us to survive. And these stories were alive long before the coming of the whites, and they will be here long after the whites are gone. They said that these are the essential building blocks of the society, and so they made no apologies for keeping this tradition alive. Tape recorders were absolutely essential to me. I remember the first tape recorder I worked with. It was crushed, I remember, in the hold of a BOAC airplane on my way home. But it was always giving me trouble. I had been working with it, and something went wrong. Something stopped working. And friends of mine identified a monk who was in a monastery in the hills, who was an expert carver. And he was able to carve out of wood this piece, electronic piece that went into the tape recorder with a spring in it, and the thing worked. And I remember also that during one storytelling session, I had been using the tape recorder quite heavily, and I was getting a little bit worried about whether I was overtaxing it. And I took it apart and looked inside, and there were two rubber belts, and they were beginning to fray. And I touched one of the belts with a pencil, and it broke. And there was no way. I was miles from Johannesburg. There was no way that I could get a belt. And so it was during a break in the story that I identified this problem. And I went off into the bushes. I had a sewing kit with me. And I took off my jockey shorts and cut off the elastic in it and approximated the size of the belt and made two of them and sewed them together. And the thing worked, and it worked for the rest of that time in South Africa. But unfortunately, the tape recorder died an unhappy death on the way back to the United States. The second time I went, and then from then on, I did what a lot of American university students do when they're heading to Africa or somewhere else and need to use a tape recorder. I stopped in Frankfurt, Germany, and picked up a Uhr tape recorder. And these are just magnificent. Not only the sound quality, but they're very compact and put up with an awful lot of ill usage. But they weighed pretty heavy, 8 to 10 pounds, and so I carried this thing with me. It was like an appendage. I carried it with me everywhere I went, and as my knapsack filled with the 5 size D batteries that it takes. What I would do is, since the 5-inch tapes, I got about 6.5 hours on each side of the tape, so the tapes were very thin. But what it did was it allowed me to tape stories without interrupting storytellers or anything like that. There's no way. I never interrupted a storyteller because of the tape. If the tape recorder went bad, that was tough. That was my problem. But I never interfered with the storytelling session. Another thing I never did was the microphone. I never attached it to the storyteller or to the performer. I would put it on the ground or put it as near to the person as I could get it. And then just take a chance on it. So that my tapes are not the most beautiful quality, but I did not want to interfere with the storyteller's body, with what she was doing. I remember once working with an oral poet who was the official poet for the king, and he was performing in front of the king outside with a huge audience, about 400 people. And he moved around while he was telling while he was creating his poetry. And I simply put my tape recorder in the grass, my microphone, hoping that it would work and that he didn't move too far away from it, and it actually worked very well. So the tape recorder just was, this tape recorder was just magnificent. It picked up voices very effectively, and it was a very compact tape recorder, and very easy to operate, which is very important for me, and also. There were times when some of the storytellers insisted that I sit back with the audience, and if anything was going to be done with the tape recorder, they would do it. And so I would give some lessons in how to work with the tape recorder, and they would quickly master them and then be in control of the tape recorder itself. I used cellulose tapes when I was collecting materials, 5-inch cellulose tapes. And I could get 13 hours of storytelling on the two sides of the tape. And I had a large number of them, obviously, with 9,000 to 10,000 stories at the end. And I was very concerned about these tapes, whether they would disintegrate over time. And what I did was I kept them in a bank vault because the temperature is constant, in order to make sure that if there was such a process, that this might slow it down. Several years ago, the American Library Association came out with a study that these cellulose tapes around the world were disintegrating, and this really frightened me about how I could possibly get these tapes into another form where I would not lose these stories. And when I had first come back from my first trip in South Africa and was very excited about my tapes, I was very anxious to have somewhere where they could be deposited for use of scholars. And I went to the Memorial Library here in Madison, Wisconsin, and at that time, the library was not much interested in tapes. They suggested that I send them down to the Folklore Institute at Indiana University. So I didn't do anything with them. But then when this Library Association study came out, this was frightening to me. And what happened was some friends in the African Studies program put me into contact with Kenneth Fraser, who is the head librarian here at the university. And he has very imaginative and very far-sighted ideas about what libraries are, and these ideas include taped voices and so forth. So it was just wonderful to begin to develop a program with Kenneth Fraser and with his remarkable group of experts in digitizing and so forth. And it took 2 years. What I did was I took all of my field notes and typed them into my computer. It took a bit of time, and I have something like 10 volumes, I think it's 10 volumes, of materials that are related to the tapes. So each story has its own introduction, who was in the audience, and so forth. So 2 years it took to get all of those tapes digitized, and they've now all been digitized. What the library is doing right now is in the process of digitizing my slides, of which there are some 4,000 or 4,500, and the same number of black and white photographs, and then they're going to do something about my Super 8mm motion picture materials, so that all of these materials will be ultimately digitized and, at least for the next generation, will be safe. Another wonderful thing that the library has done is this. There's no way that I could ever have paid storytellers for what they were doing. And in any case, they were not professionals, so payment was not really a part of the plan. But the idea of inviting an outsider like me created some problems, and so I really developed a kind of a project that was that involved both me and the storytellers. Here was the argument: if they allowed me to tape their stories, when freedom came to South Africa, all of these stories would go back to South Africa. And with the help of Ken Fraser and the Memorial Library, this is exactly what's going to happen. When we're finished with all of this, a complete set will go to the University of Cape Town in South Africa for the use of scholars there. So I am so totally indebted to the library and to all of these experts who have been working with me on this project. We've got a ways to go yet, but we're well into it. The library's publication process, called the Parallel Press, is in the process of taking 3 volumes of Zulu and Xhosa transcriptions that I have done, and we'll be publishing those. And at the same time that they'll be publishing those in book form, they will also go on the internet. So it's a new kind of an idea about publishing, that publishing, it takes place in the traditional way, but it also takes place in cyberspace, and that excites me a lot as well.
This program is a single-channel video version of Harold Scheub's The Storyteller, an interactive multimedia presentation delivered via the web using an application called eTeach. eTeach is a new technology developed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which allows instructors to create dynamic and engaging course presentations using PowerPoint combined with audio and/or video. The eTeach authoring tool allows you to synchronize and combine time-based media, either flash video or MP3 audio, PowerPoint slides and slide notes, a table of contents, references to web-based resources, captions containing the text transcript of the audio, and self-assessment quizzes, combining all of these into a freestanding learning object. eTeach presentations are accessible to those who use assistive technologies, such as JAWS. For more information about eTeach, please visit eteach.doit.wisc.edu.
Inamanyala lendoda kuna